I'm Bill Barol. Over the last few decades, I've done every kind of writing there is to do, from journalism to humor, books, movies, and television.
I'm Matt Ricardo. For the last 30 years, I've toured the world as a variety performer.
We've come together across the Atlantic to talk about creativity, what it is, where it comes from, why it matters.
Thomas Edison said, "To invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk."
This is Imagination and Junk, a conversation about the hard work of creativity.
Episode 9. Catch Me If You Can. Dear Bill, when Jodie Foster won her first Academy Award, according to her, here's what was going through her mind. I thought they'd come knocking on my door saying we meant to give that to someone else. That was for Meryl Streep. When Meryl Streep gets offered a part, according to her, she thinks, why would anyone want to see me in a movie? I don't know how to act anyway. Why am I doing this? Penelope Cruz says that she's convinced she's going to get fired during the first week of every single film she's ever been in. When the late Dr. Maya Angelou sat down to write, she'd think, they're going to find me out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. It's time to talk about impostor syndrome. And as you might imagine, I have opinions. Opinions which perhaps some of our listenership might disagree with. Or maybe that's just what my imposter syndrome is telling me. Well, no, it's not, because I don't have imposter syndrome. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a swaggering, uber-confident, bulletproof master of my universe. I'm often about as resilient as a meringue left out in the rain. There's a twitchy anxiety hanging along in the back of my head most of the time. Whenever I make something, at the moment I'm finished, or often before that, I'm resigned to nobody caring about it. When a project fails, my immediate reaction is, more often than not, well, yeah, fair enough. But I don't feel like an imposter. I just feel like, well, yeah, this is what this is. Some things succeed, some don't. Not everyone will like me, most won't. For some reason, I've never clicked with the digital idea of being a hit or a miss, a success or a failure, genuine or fraud, the real thing or an imposter. Perhaps this comes from spending my life in a genre that produces precious little in the way of global superstars. Perhaps it's helped by a foundation as a street performer, where the acceptance of audience disinterest and low expectations are keys to sanity. Maybe, though, there's something else going on here. The concept of imposter syndrome was first established in a 1978 study of how it affects high-achieving women. Notice something about all the examples I mentioned at the start of this piece? Yeah. My guess is that if you're a high-achieving woman in 1978, there's gonna be a smorgasbord of real, actual, non-subconscious reasons why you might be made to feel like you shouldn't be where you are. Did they really need to define a whole new syndrome just so they could victim blame the casualties of a male-centric culture with little in the way of positive role models, and a work environment that ranged from spoken and unspoken discouragement to outright harassment and bullying? My money is on imposter syndrome disproportionately affecting women, people of colour, queer people, and all other people who identify not as someone like me, the cishet white guy who just said that he doesn't suffer from imposter syndrome. For someone like me, the world says, you're going to be great, seize the day, try everything. But if you're not like me, then there's a decent chance you might instead be met with, oh, why you got to be so pushy? Now, these aren't hard and fast rules. Nothing is that simple, of course. There are the most tippity-top dudes who, I'm sure, suffer crippling imposter syndrome, but I don't know. Am I right to be slightly suspicious of the roots of this concept? when really it seems to be a vague label for a collection of mental health issues mixed with societal inequalities? I'm not sure. I could be way off. Oh shit, do I have imposter syndrome about this opinion? I will talk to you soon. Matt.
Dear Matt, I also have opinions, which is a good thing because if I didn't, this would be a very short episode. Let me start out with one that I cannot in the least defend, and which will probably send some of our listeners screaming for the exits in high dudgeon. And to those listeners, I say, I'm sorry if you can't handle my truth. I'm just a very honest person, which is a thing that shallow, terrible people say when they don't have the courage of their worthless convictions. In the taxonomy of sleazy dodges, it's second only to the infamous non-apology apology. I'm sorry you feel that way. Anyway, here's my unpopular opinion. Maya Angelou? Don't care for her. Never have. Now, I'm not talking here about the Maya Angelou who wrote I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, a memoir that is much beloved among people who've read it, of whom I am not one. I'm talking about the Maya Angelou who functioned as a 24-hour quote machine, cranking out bits of pithy, fortune cookie-sized folk wisdom, which tend to get less and less meaningful the more you reflect on them. This is the Maya Angelou who said, try to be a rainbow in someone's cloud, and I believe life loves the liver of life, and the sun scorches into clarity those things the more unassuming moon can never touch. I made one of those up. My guess is you can't immediately tell which one it is, unless you're a Maya Angelou superfan, in which case Godspeed and more power to you. Or, as Dr. Angelou herself once said, the heart knows itself beyond knowing, and heartfulness and selfhood. Or did she? I'll confess that I was not aware of the circumstances under which the term impostor syndrome was first defined. And yeah, looked at in the light of its origin, it's reasonable to argue that impostor syndrome is a sort of jujitsu move society uses to trick its least empowered members into feeling even more powerless, and so maintain its dominance over them. I don't think you're arguing, though, that straight, well-off white guys with every possible advantage are immune to it. In fact, you probably know some. And if you think you don't, hi, my name is Bill, and I suffer from IS. Always have. Interviews are the best example of this in my own life. I've done I don't know how many over the last 30 years. Hundreds, certainly. The interview is the factory floor of a reporter's trade. It would stand to reason that the more of them I did, the more comfortable I'd become in doing them, right? It would. But did I? I did not. During the years when I was doing them a lot, I never walked into an interview with anything less than every functional advantage. Good tools, good access, the imprimatur of one of the two giant national news magazines or some other big-time employer. And I never walked into one without butterflies in my stomach, a weird, fluttery unease that whispered to me, this is it. This is the one. This is the one where they find you out. Mick Herron, one of my favorite contemporary writers, once said, writers spend the first part of their career trying to be discovered, and the second part trying not to be found out. I can't say where this feeling came from in me. I was pretty successful pretty quickly as a young reporter in New York, probably more than I deserved. Well, there it is again. But objectively, I was. So it isn't like I was working off some early professional trauma. I think in my case, it's been rooted in a more general insecurity. But unless you have a PhD in cognitive psychology and 100 years to spare, we're not going to crack the origin story here. Besides which, who cares? It's more interesting, and I think more illuminating in a conversation about creativity, to look at what imposter syndrome did for me in a positive way in my career. And that was this. I figured out pretty early that I most likely wasn't going to be able to prevent that queasy feeling of prophecy in my gut. But that didn't mean I had to make it easy for the fates to unmask me as the fraud I doubtless was. That didn't mean it had to be today. The way I thought about it was, I could at least even up the odds a little of getting out without embarrassing myself today, and tomorrow could take care of itself. How did I even the odds? Via an absolutely manic practice of preparation. I would prepare and prepare and prepare. I would over-prepare, and then I would over-prepare. I would go into an interview knowing as much about the subject as they knew about themselves. I would know exactly how the interview would start, what ground it needed to cover, and where it would end. None of this was a guarantee that the interview would, in fact, follow that path. But by the time I walked through the door or placed the call, I knew what I didn't know and what I needed to know to write my story. I knew the delta between them. I'd make 1,000% certain that that distance was covered before I left the room. And if a conversation took an unexpected turn down a route I hadn't anticipated, great, fantastic. I'd follow it. I got some great stuff that way. But I'd always keep one eye out for the off-ramp that led back to my preparation, because I knew where I had to end up. There was a corollary to this. I would, in addition to over-preparing for an interview, in every other way, dramatically over-report my story. Archival research, expert testimony, and yes, interviews. Whatever the building materials of the story were, I made sure I had a ridiculous excess of those materials, way more than I could possibly use. And then I'd start to pare it all down. I always wanted to leave stuff on the cutting room floor. I could be economical in my writing, but never in my reporting. There was always a lot of spoilage in my reporting, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I hope you're confidently striking out on the path you set for yourself today, whatever that may be. I'll talk to you soon. Unless you decide that I'm not worth talking to anymore, which I totally understand because, Bill.
Dear Bill, what are you doing? You can't diss Maya bloody Angelou. If just one of our listeners unsubscribed because of what you said, well, that's pretty much our audience halved. But yeah, I kinda agree with you about the quotes. Although it is worth mentioning that arguably her most famous quote, which is, "A bird doesn't sing because it has an answer, it sings because it has a song," a quote so famously hers that it was chosen to accompany her face on a stamp, was, in fact, said by the children's author Joan Walsh Angland. Turns out that thanks to the internet, Maya Angelou is one of the most misquoted people in the world. But, as Dr. Angelou herself famously said, "I'm going to meet you at the corner of Know Your Role Boulevard and Jaboni Drive and check you directly into the Smackdown Hotel if you smell what Dr. Angelou is cooking anyway." Perhaps, and we've touched on this before, the differences in the ways we got to our gigs are part of this. You were sent to interviews by your editor, so it feels like there's immediately an algorithm of stress there. You need to impress the boss while projecting confidence and competence to your interviewee. That's tricky. I mostly get my own gigs, so I usually felt that I was working at the level at which I had naturally floated to and no higher. Not always, though. Sometimes there would be shows that I was very aware were a step up, even if just a temporary one. And on those occasions, like you, I doubled down on preparation. Apart from anything else, preparation is a good way to distract your brain from being scared or anxious. Give yourself tasks. Clean the props, run the script, iron the costume, make sure that everything that is within your control is as good as it can be, then that'll leave as much mental real estate as possible to cope with the unforeseen. And since we're doing quotes, here's one I recite often. Chance favours the prepared mind. It's good, right? You know who said it? Travis Dane, the bad guy from the Steven Seagal action classic Under Siege 2: Dark Territory. And at the risk of alienating our one remaining listener after your Maya Angelou debacle, I'm going to come right out and say that Under Siege 2: Dark Territory is better than Under Siege 1. There, I said it. I mean, okay, chance favours the prepared mind was originally said by Louis Pasteur, but did he hijack a military satellite to enact revenge against the military-industrial complex that betrayed him, only to be stopped by a portly Aikido expert with odd hair? No, to the best of my knowledge, no, he did not. What is this podcast about again? I think I've forgotten. Oh yeah, we're talking about imposter syndrome. Preparation. Preparation, certainly for me, seems a really useful strategy for coping with any kind of feeling of being out of your depth. Control every aspect of the situation that you're able to control. Over-prepare. I've done a few seasons of a stage show which would involve me interviewing celebrities on stage. I knew that I wanted the interviews to come across like a very casual chat, to let them have the freedom to go in whatever direction happened, and the way I got this to happen was to over-prepare. To have many, many more questions ready to be asked than I could ever need. That way I wasn't scared that the chat might go cold, and at the same time, I had so many questions that there would be a good chance that the conversation would freewheel into some of them of its own accord. Often it would look like we just happened to hit on something where the interviewee had something great to say, when in fact, as soon as it looked like we were going that way, I had the question up my sleeve waiting. Chance favours the prepared mind. Seriously, if you haven't seen Under Siege 2: Dark Territory, then, well, it is a great, awful, bad movie. In the very early 90s, I got booked to be the opening act for the late great British comedian Bob Monkhouse at a Christmas party for a huge evil media company. Most of our non-UK listeners probably haven't heard of Bob, but he was a mainstay of British entertainment from the late 50s until his death in 2003. He acted in movies and on TV, was a legendary game show host, but at his heart, he was a slick, meticulous and very funny stand-up. When I said I wanted to be a comedian, people laughed at me, he would say. Well, they're not laughing now. I remember, after I'd done my 10 minutes, I sat in the wings to watch Bob do an hour. He had prepared. Pretty much every other joke had been tailored to be about someone in the company, someone in the audience. He'd researched all their favourite things, embarrassing moments. He literally had a dossier about the audience with which he'd written a bespoke set. It was amazing. It felt like some kind of magic trick. The famous comedian has jokes that are all about us. He couldn't have killed any harder. But I guess if you don't have that almost psychotically driven approach to perfection, how it usually works is that the more you do something, the less you have to prepare. Those costume shirts still have to be ironed, but for me, over the years, the more gigs I did well at, the more I started to feel like I know what I'm doing. I can do this. I can rely on my wits and muscle memory. Did that part happen for you, or does that not work for someone who's writing about something different or interviewing someone different every time? I'm in my comfy chair looking out of the window, and the sky is bright, brilliant, cloudless blue. But it's got cold here over the last couple of weeks, windy too. But the fox that comes to sleep in our garden is back again today, lolling on its back in a patch of sunlight by the fence. When I do the dishes, it blinks at me through the kitchen window. I blink back, and it goes back to sleep. Hope you've got a good patch of sunlight to loll in. I'll talk to you soon. Matt.
Dear Matt, you have a fox in your garden? How positively bucolic. The closest we have is a possum, who likes to pimp roll through our backyard every night around 3 a.m. I like to show the security camera footage to Jennifer because it freaks her out. And she's not wrong. Have you ever seen a possum up close? They look like nature's mistake. Also, I'm not sure, but they seem to have some anger management issues. One time I spotted one in daylight. May have been the same one, I don't know. He was apparently confused on this particular day about the working hours required for the job. And when I approached him, he hissed at me so hard, I actually screamed a little. You're right that we arrive at our working environments in different ways. You more or less get yourself to the stage, while I go to an interview at the behest of an editor. And yes, this does mean that I'm serving two masters. There's the need to bring back fresh kill, and the need to not embarrass myself while getting it. But if you do the second of those, the first will generally take care of itself. And preparation is the key. This means, by the way, being prepared against every eventuality that affirms your feelings of fraudulence. Not just the one in which your mind slips out for a walk and leaves you staring at your subject with a blank expression on your face while you wish silently that the floor would open up and swallow you. No. The impostor syndrome is big, it is broad, and it is adaptable. It will, like a colorless gas, seep invisibly through any opening you give it. Early in my time at Newsweek, I interviewed Penn and Teller, and they were exactly as entertaining and hilarious as you think they were. And I was so absorbed in the conversation because, yes, you're right, that's what preparation does. It makes it possible for the interview to take on the contours of a conversation, which is a much more alive thing. I was so absorbed that I failed to notice the little red low battery light on my tape recorder flashing an SOS. When I got back to my office and attempted to play the conversation back, I was greeted with the sound of the tape slowing and finally grinding to a terrible dead stop. Like, I told myself in that moment, my career itself, because I was a fraud and now here was the proof. Because Penn and Teller were at a moment in their career where they needed the kind of exposure a piece in Newsweek could provide, their management agreed to give me a second crack at them. For the rest of my career, Whenever a kid starting in journalism would ask me if I had one piece of career advice to offer, just one, expecting something grand like pursue truth or illuminate injustice, I would always tell them this: put fresh batteries in your tape recorder before every interview. Not some interviews, every interview. Today it'd be make sure your phone's holding a solid charge. Same principle. So yes, you want to control every aspect of the environment that you possibly can. There are aspects you can't control. The trick is to know the difference. If you've properly prepared the ground, you up the odds that anything unforeseen will accrue to your benefit, like a serendipitous turn in the conversation that leads you someplace your preparation didn't anticipate. Those are good accidents, the best kind. You asked if muscle memory kicks in for me when doing interviews, the way it does for you when you're on stage. Well, yes and no. It does with procedural things. I always start an interview by filling my subject in a general way on the approach my story will take. There are any number of ways to frame a story. I always figured it was courteous and not for nothing time efficient to give the subject the drift. I always end it by asking if there's anything they wanted to talk about that I didn't give them a chance to get into. This gives them, and you, a second swing at the material. Those things became second nature. Then there's stuff that's purely mechanical. If there's a seat that looks into the sun, I always take it. You don't want a subject squinting or fighting off a headache or a vague sense that he's uncomfortable in a way he can't explain. Like a performance, an interview is a souffle, and it can fall for any number of reasons. So you try to minimize the irritants. That puts the subject at ease, and it helps you feel in control. For me, that's always been a way of telling the voices in my head to pipe down. In another sense, of course, muscle memory doesn't come into play. Every subject, every story is different. So, again, you prepare. You get as familiar with it as you can before you walk in the door. I talked a minute ago about knowing what I don't know, and to me that's always been the heart of my preparation. I once improvised a riff when talking to a room full of high school kids who were interested in journalism about how reporting is, basically, a 3-step process. 1. Figure out what you don't know. 2. Figure out who does know it. 3. Go talk to them. I don't think I ever managed to say it better. I also told them about the battery thing. Thanks for the movie tip. I didn't remember until I went online to look at the trailer that I've actually seen Under Siege 2. But I think you'd agree that all mid-90s action flicks tend to kind of morph together in memory. I mean, the terrorists were always described as international terrorists, which seems kind of sweet and nostalgic now. There was always a silky smooth criminal mastermind with a dry sense of humor. Eric Bogosian in this one. Very 90s choice. And there was usually a Baldwin involved, although sometimes it was Adam Baldwin, who is a Baldwin, but not one of those Baldwins, a confusion which probably got him through more than one audition. So yeah, I do remember the picture, although I didn't recall that in it, Seagal outruns an explosion. By the 2000s, which is the last time I was paying attention, he got winded walking around his patrol car in the very excellent proto-reality series Steven Seagal Lawman. But that's another story. I'll talk to you next time. Bill.
Dear Bill, yeah, we have a few foxes that come and hang out in our garden. Often, I'll come home in the early hours after performing in a late-night show, and I'll walk up my street and see a fox digging in a trash can for supper. It'll look up at me with shiny eyes to make sure that I'm no threat, then go back to looking for discarded KFC. I always feel a connection. The only two animals in an otherwise silent, dark street, both of us different kinds of scrappy, nocturnal resident. The battery thing is good advice. People always want some kind of sage, open to interpretation, Yoda-type wisdom, but concrete stuff like that is always more useful. When I interviewed legendary British magician Paul Daniels, I asked him, from one working cabaret act to another, what single piece of advice he'd give me. His response? Never leave money in the dressing room. I've done enough interviews on stage to think I kind of know some of what I'm doing-ish, but I don't feel relaxed doing it. Certainly not the way I do when I'm doing my act. Maybe it's because there's someone else on stage with me, so if I screw it up, it wouldn't just be me that plummets to the ground in a ball of flame. I've got a passenger. I'm still always in my head, very aware of the things I need to keep an eye on. Timings, the path of the conversation, things I want to make sure to get to, listening to what they're saying, what the audience will want to hear. For me, doing an interview feels much more like juggling a bunch of things than when I actually juggle a bunch of things. You're right, though, about controlling your environment. That's yet another thing I learned as a street performer. And, just like you, one of the things to consider, along with am I blocking any shop doorways, am I going to get noise complaints, is there anything fun I can climb on, is where the sun is. And just like you, I put it in my eyes rather than the audience's. Maybe the more one does in preparation, the less one might feel like an imposter. I know that for me, if I can walk into a venue and do a good sound check, sort out the lighting, make sure everything technical is as good as it can be, then apart from all those things giving me the best chance of doing a good job, it also makes me feel like I know what I'm doing before I've even started the show. All this talk of imposter syndrome has got me thinking, though. Imposter syndrome sounds like a bad thing, right? But if you take away the syndrome part, it gets more interesting. Imposters can be fun. You say imposter, and you think of people like Frank Abagnale, famously played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Spielberg's Catch Me If You Can, a daring con artist looking for adventure, even though it turns out that most of the real Frank Abagnale's tales of swashbuckling deceit were in fact themselves invented. Frank was an imposter pretending to be an imposter. Not so the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra. They played an entire series of concerts in Hong Kong in the year 2000 to audiences of 10,000 people, except the real Moscow Philharmonic were touring in a whole different country at the time. My favourite imposter, though, might be Barry Bremen. Barry Bremen made it onto the court as a fake member of the NBA All-Star team, onto the field as a fake New York Yankee for the baseball All-Star game, went in drag as a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader for a game against Washington, pretended to be a referee at a Super Bowl, snuck into and played golf in 3 separate US Opens, and he even went up on stage to accept an Emmy that, fairly obviously, he had not won. This got me thinking. Maybe we should just ignore the complicated and problematic history of imposter syndrome and focus on the fact that pretty much all of us, I'd guess, at some point, to some degree, feel like we're pretending. I'm 52 and a half years old and I only occasionally feel like an adult, but I do what we all do. I pretend. Being an imposter of the thing you want to be is a good way of getting there. While you're pretending, keep working at building the skills, craft, talent, experience, confidence, whatever you need to back up what you're claiming to be. And every day, with luck, you'll be faking it a little less. Now, I am, of course, not suggesting that you sneak into the Emmys and walk up on stage to claim an award that you didn't win, like Barry did, but you know what? In 2014, ESPN made a series of documentaries, and one of them was about Barry Bremen, and it won an Emmy. I'll talk to you soon, Matt.
Dear Matt, so now it's a few foxes. You start out as an incidental observer of stray, solitary wildlife. The next thing I know, you're walking around in a cartoon menagerie. Should it alarm me, by the way, that you compared yourself to a possibly rabid wild animal? I just assume all animals I see are rabid, including my own dogs, Frankie and Dash. It's safer that way. Compared yourself to a wild animal rooting in a garbage can for sustenance? I mean, I know we've all been cooped up at home for too long, but man, you and I are going to have to do some self-affirmations. I'm just kidding. I don't know any self-affirmations. I think you're onto something when you suggest that the best thing to do with imposter syndrome is to strike the troublesome word syndrome with its intimations of pathology and simply embrace the imposter part. Just pretend. Pretending is a thing we encourage our kids to do. Can't be bad, can it? When you propose that we simply pretend to be that thing we doubt we truly are and keep building the skills that will help us eventually banish that doubt, is that really so different from the advice proffered by, depending on which source you credit, either Jesuit religious philosophy or the playwright David Mamet? Act as if you have faith, and faith will be given to you. Side note, second time around for that quote in our podcast. It's handy. And look, anytime you can credibly source something to either the Jesuits or David Mamet, that's a good day at the office. You're absolutely right that there's something dashing about the adventures of all-pro fabulists like Frank Abagnale and Barry Bremen. But I have to say there's also something a little wistful about those stories now. Stories where, if he had enough nerve and imagination, a guy could just walk onto the field at the Super Bowl. I don't think it's a coincidence that the great pretenders you cite all did their best work before the advent of the security state we all now live in. It's a world of a lot fewer unlocked doors and a lot more surveillance cameras than it used to be. This is a shame for many reasons, and one of them is that, in the context of creativity, a good burst of pretending can do wonders. Let go of your assumptions about what you can't do, which is what impostor syndrome is at bottom, and embrace a foolish conviction that you can. This is an act of will, but all creativity is an act of will. And as handy as concrete experience can be in certain applications, never leave money in the dressing room is a good example, it's no substitute for a good whopping leap of faith. Every act of creativity is a leap of faith. Every blank page marked with the first stroke of a pen, every canvas daubed with the first swab of paint, every swipe of a carver's knife or a sculptor's mallet, every one is a deliberate decision to slip the bonds of earth and go flailing into the unknown. Why not at least flail with a measure of confidence? The world won't be shy about bringing you back down to the ground. Take your moment of invention and lean into it with the conviction that you can. There's nothing to be lost except that small voice that whispers otherwise. Send that voice packing. Pretend. I'll talk to you next time. Bill. Imagination and Junk is written by Bill Barol in the U.S. and Matt Ricardo in the U.K., with audio production by Bill Barol. For more information, show notes, and bonus content, it's imaginationandjunk.com.